Well, thank you very much for the warm welcome. Greetings from Trumpland, from whence I've proceeded, and it's interesting to be here in Morrisonland in all of its richness, diversity and wonder. Speaker Steve Martin from the Australian Parliament, former Secretary of the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet Terry Moran, my former partners in national crime, and other friends and colleagues who I've known from the business community and other parts of the country over the years. Thank you for the invitation from CEDA. It's your 60th anniversary year, as I understand it. Well done. Having institutions which take the country's long-term trajectories seriously is important. We don't have many of them outside the halls of government. Those within the halls of government often are under duress, political or funding or policy constraints. What you do outside the halls of government is really important. And if I listen carefully to the discussion this morning and reflect assiduously on the great debates around the world today, our country's future, this country, once called the lucky country, what I now see as the complacent country, is not responding effectively to the three great global change drivers washing over us. One is in geopolitics and the emerging rift between China and the United States, which is ripping countries and polities apart way beyond these shores, but ours as well. As the bifurcation of the US-China relationship continues apace. The second is the great challenge of climate change as the world struggles to adapt and as the world struggles to act. And this will be the thrust of my remarks today. The third, touched on by Jenny Hewitt before, was the revolution in technology which is washing across the economies of the world, not just in all the domains and subdomains of artificial intelligence, but dividing the world effectively into those who are taking the commanding heights of innovation and commercialization, and those who will be the also-rans. And I fear where we end up in this deep transformation of what is called around the world the Fourth Industrial Revolution. So when institutions like CEDA take these challenges globally seriously, I say good on you, CEDA. It's important that we have considered, impartial voices on these, bringing the challenges squarely to bear on the body politic in this country. In 2007, I called climate change the greatest economic, environmental and moral challenge of our generation. I made no apology for it then. I make no apology for it today. It remains my position as of this moment. I did so because I knew that Australia, as one of the world's 20 largest emitters in the world, and the single highest per capita emitter of greenhouse gases in the world, had a responsibility to act, both our collective responsibility to protect the planet, but also our responsibility intergenerationally to our kids and to our grandkids. You ask why I use, therefore, the term moral challenge? That's it. If you're concerned about those who come after us, you are making a moral decision. If you're concerned only about you, yourself and I, you're making an amoral decision. That's why I use the term moral challenge. But beyond those considerations, I could also see how vulnerable our economy was to the impacts of climate change. I commissioned the Garnaut report back in 2007 when I was Leader of the Opposition. Garnaut found when he reported in 2008, and I quote, "Fire seasons will start earlier, end slightly later, and generally be more intense, and that this should generally become observable by 2020, unquote. We have seen this come to pass before our very eyes. It's not rocket science, it's not metaphysics, it's what we quaintly from the public policy community describe as science. Since then, the scientific case for action has become even stronger. According to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, in its latest assessment report of 2014, we face the threat of temperatures up to 4.8 degrees higher by 2100. Sea levels rising by just under a metre on average globally by 2100. And according to their special report of 2018, the IPCC said the future is even more frightening if we cannot stay within the more ambitious 1.5 degrees centigrade limit enshrined in the Paris Agreement, let alone the 2 degrees increase that we are currently on track to see. In fact, even more than that, its impact on biodiversity will be massive. These objective conclusions by the International Panel of Climate Change Scientists march in lockstep with what the CSIRO has said as our authoritative independent national scientific body in Australia as well. The CSIRO has clocked that so far we've already seen a 1 degree increase in temperatures over the last 90 years to 100 years, resulting in, according to CSIRO, extremely high monthly maximum temperatures, which are now 6 times more common than they used to be. Mid-year rainfall has declined by about 11% in southeastern Australia since the 1990s. In the southwest, rainfall is now down 20% since 1970. Droughts, according to the CSIRO, are expected to last up to 20% longer by 2090. They expect that sea level rises of almost a metre by 2090 and higher still if the Antarctic ice sheet collapses. These are not matters of opinion, these are matters of scientific conclusion, and therefore should form the basis for any policy discussion which we in this nation have on what to do in response nationally and critically internationally. These predictions in science all come with an economic cost. Indeed, according to Deloitte Access Economics, the total economic cost of natural disasters in the 10 years to 2016 averaged just under 19 billion per year. That's equivalent to 1.2% of GDP each and every year. Those of you who doubt these figures, speak to your major insurance firms and ask them what's happening with all categories of insurance associated with natural disasters. Not a question of opinion, a matter of economic and financial fact. These are not contestable data points, as many in this country seem to think that they are. That's just bullshit. Also, natural disasters don't just take lives, destroy homes and crush livelihoods, as we've seen this summer. They close ports, they sap insurance pools, they devastate food production, they undermine tourism, and they smash government budgets. Yet despite all of this, we continue to live in the complacent country when it comes to concrete national and international action on climate change. Sometimes it's important to put this into a global perspective. As the latest UN emissions gap report has told us at the end of last year, even if every country now fully implements their current Paris targets for emissions reductions, we are still on track for a 3.2 degrees centigrade average warming by the end of this century. If everyone does what they committed to in Paris, we will still see temperatures by century's end 3 degrees centigrade warmer than they are now. This, to me, coming from the driest continent on Earth, commands action. And if every country did as little as Australia is doing at present, then global average temperatures will be measurably worse than what I've just referred. It is nonsense to claim, as many climate change denialists do in this country, that the rest of the world is not acting at all. China, now the world's largest emitter, flatlined its emissions between 2014 and 2016 and is expected to peak its emissions by its planned date of 2030, if not well before. China still needs to do more, but the proposition that China is doing nothing is empirically unsustainable. The European Union has committed to achieve a 30% reduction in emissions by 2030 on 1990 levels and is expected to soon increase this target to at least 35%. The United Kingdom is likely now to go even further individually in its own name. Just the other day, Prime Minister Johnson's Conservative government announced they were bringing forward a ban on new diesel, petrol and even hybrid vehicles in 2035, in yet another demonstration of their climate leadership. The argument, therefore, that the rest of the world is not acting on climate change mitigation efforts, that is, bringing down greenhouse gas emissions, is a demonstrable lie. If someone offers that argument in the debate here in Australia, it is disprovable from the facts. Not a question of opinion, it is a matter of fact. Regrettably, the Australian climate action story is the reverse to the international story that I've just referred to. The documentary record is that successive Conservative governments have now sought to carve out ways for Australia to get away with doing very little at all. Right back in 1997, during the negotiations for the original Kyoto Protocol, it was the Howard government that held the entire process hostage at the 11th hour until they, that is the United Nations, granted us, that is Australia, an exception to let Australia actually increase its emissions by 8% over the 5 years to 2012. People may have forgotten that. That was the original deal done by the then Conservative government and the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change for what is called the first Kyoto commitment period, which took effect between 2008 and 2012. We threatened effectively to collapse the conference unless they agreed to allow us to increase our emissions by 8% over that period of time. Howard also insisted on counting reduced land clearing towards this target, while knowing full well that land clearing had already been in steep decline in Australia since 1990. That is the year that the Howard government proposed as the baseline for calculating what we would do as far as the overall reduction in emissions was concerned. And then, to add insult to injury, the Howard government then refused to ratify Kyoto. I did this as my first act as Prime Minister in 2007. So let's be honest about it, Australia was never going to miss our target under the Kyoto first commitment period because it was such a lousy target. It was low to begin with and deliberately constructed as such. Our second Kyoto target was much more substantial. We committed to a unilateral reduction of 5% in our emissions on 2000 levels by 2020. But we also made sure it came with a carrot attached that if other countries made ambitious commitments, we were prepared to increase that 5% reduction target to 25%. That is by a factor of 5. At the time my government left office in 2013, our policies had Australian emissions on track to reach their lowest level in 2 decades by 2020. But under the Conservatives since then, Australian emissions have risen on average 1% a year every year. Indeed, the universally respected consultancy Endeavour Environmental, which measures each nation's carbon emissions around the world and is respected as such as being an impartial scientific body, it says that Australia's annual emissions are now the highest they have ever been if you include land clearing. The government recently put out some controversially optimistic figures showing that as a best case, emissions have risen in each of the last 3 years. That's their best case. But in the 4th year, they say, they reduce by what could be, frankly, not much more than a rounding error. Assuming you could sustain that trajectory, we'd ultimately reach net zero based on the current government's projections, not until the middle, not of this century, not of next century, but the following century. Other countries around the world are committing to net zero emissions by 2050. On current trajectories in Australia, we would reach this by 2250. Other words, just 200 years late. Again, this is not a matter of opinion, it's simply fact based on the current numbers if you draw the line. Mr Morrison may say that we will meet and beat our 20 target under the second Kyoto commitment period. The only reason is that it was an appallingly low target of 5% reductions by 2020 anyway, when measured against our 2000 levels to begin with. The Conservative government has never increased this 5% target despite the ambitious regime agreed to in the Paris Accord only 5 years ago, an outcome which, if we were still in government, would have triggered our governments to increase its carbon reduction target to a 25% cut. Instead, the Abbott government, sticking with a 5% only cut by 2020, it created one of the lowest bars in the world today, particularly when you consider the baseline that we are working off going back to Howard under the first Kyoto commitment period. But despite that very low bar, the current government is still struggling even to meet that. The Abbott government then went about low-barring Australia's emission reductions targets under the Paris commitment period covering 2020-2030. If you're confused by this schemata, it's like this. First Kyoto commitment period, 2008-2012. Second Kyoto Commitment period, 2012-2020. Paris Commitment period, starting this year, 2020 through to 2030. And that is how the international community globally works. You make commitments for each of these periods, they give you policy flexibility as to how you deliver it, and they then measure what's actually happening with your national emissions performance and then make a judgment as to whether you're on track or not. My overall argument to you here today is that on the first and the second and the third of these, frankly, the targets we have set for ourselves have been low bar to start with, and in the most recent ones, we are still in grave difficulty of not realising those targets, given the paucity of policy measures which have been embarked upon by the government. The final point I'd make in terms of the technical aspects of this presentation concern the use of so-called carbon credits. Who in the room has heard of the government's use of carbon credits in realising their overall carbon commitments? Again, this is somewhat esoteric, but let me just put it to you in these terms. It is an argument which says if we in the past have overachieved in Kyoto Period 1 and Kyoto Period 2 against the benchmarks we set, we get to store those credits over here and bank them against our future obligations in the Paris Commitment period of 2020 to 2030. There's a problem with that, and the problem is as follows. No one else in the world agrees that you can do that. That is, that in the Kyoto period, which concludes this year, 2020, you could use carbon credits under international agreement, but you cannot do so under the Paris Agreement of 2015, which covers now the 2020-2030 period. There is one government in the world which argues that you can, and you're looking at it, not me, but the one which currently governs this country. Now, this has fundamental consequences for the planet, because if, in Australia's case, if you were to take the credits, that is the overachievement that we realised up until 2020, largely on the basis of the actions taken under my government, that would mean 370 metric tonnes of Kyoto credits which can be used to offset our future responsibilities from this year on to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions onto 2030. In other words, we get to underperform yet again, drawing upon the credits of what we achieved in government ourselves. But leave that to one side. You may think this is just political sour grapes. We in the Labor government did the right thing, we performed, we brought about genuine greenhouse gas reductions, and the current government is using those credits against the future in order to make their performance look better, even though their future targets for overall greenhouse gas reductions are modest in the first place. Leave that argument to one side. What is the real danger here? No other government at the most recently convened Conference of the Parties in Madrid at the end of last year has agreed with this approach. If they were to do so and agreed this was legitimate not just for Australia, but all the other major emitters in the world, you're not just looking at 300 or so, 370 metric tonnes of Kyoto credits, you're looking at 13 billion megatonnes of unused carbon credits from all the other emitters who had accumulated credits themselves in the period leading up to 2020. In other words, those countries could use those credits to bank against the future as well, and therefore reduce their overall future substantive actions to bring down greenhouse gas emissions. That is the essential danger of the approach that we are now adopting as Australia. And on this point, could I make this as an overall pitch? When Australia acts in this manner, we are not just regarded as a minor irrelevant participant. This country is a G20 economy. It is the 12th largest in the world. Taken together with other economies whose total emissions represent between 1% and 2% of global greenhouse gas emissions each, we represent together, those middle-sized economies, something like 1/4 of the world's total greenhouse gas emissions. So if a country like us just walks out the door and says, hey, we're not taking this seriously, and secondly, we're going to rort the rules, the ripple effect of that in terms of the rest of the international community is significant. Not just reputationally, where it serves to trash our global image as responsible global citizens and participate effectively in multilateral responses to common global problems, but in the precedent it establishes for other large-scale emitters. As I move to conclude these remarks before we go to questions, I want to reflect on what we have been able to achieve so far and point to some future courses of action. If you look back at the record of what we have actually done in reducing greenhouse gas emissions in Australia, 3 measures were taken, all under my government, and 2 of them remain. Nothing else has been done by way of concrete policy decision, which as of today is additionally reducing greenhouse gas emissions. The first of those measures we took in 2009, which was the introduction of the mandatory renewable energy target. When we were elected, Renewable stood at less than 4% of total electricity supply in this country. The figure today is 27%. Why? We introduced a law to make it mandatory. But what the industry has done, building on the law and the legislation that we said, which was 20% by 2020, is the industry has developed its own critical mass, its own self-confidence, and grown. As a result, the original plan we had, which was to have a renewable energy industry in Australia which was not infantile, but developed and mature and of sufficient critical mass to begin becoming a major player in domestic electricity markets, the policy has worked and the legislation has remained in force. And by law, we have made it possible for this industry to come into being. Achievement number 1, and that of itself, in itself, as demonstrated by research from independent institutions, has resulted in some 2.2 million small-scale renewable systems being installed across the country within the framework of the renewable energy target, and therefore represents of itself 1/3 of our total abatement efforts so far. So when you hear the argument nothing has happened, please bear that in mind. That is real, and despite attempts to both amend, water down and repeal that legislation, the Senate so far has resisted that. Number 2 was, of course, the pricing of carbon. That of itself, when it was introduced, between the years 2012 and 14, resulted annually in an 8.2% drop in overall emissions before the Abbott government repealed it in 2015. Thirdly, the much maligned energy-efficient homes package, made up of insulation for homes, together with solar panels for roofs, subsidised, and solar hot water systems, effectively covered about 22% of the nation's total housing stock. The consequence of that, of itself, has been to reduce total emissions of nearly 20 million tonnes of CO2 equivalent. 40% of all household energy in Australia is devoted to heating and cooling. That is why we did what we did. As you know, there were problems in the implementation of the program. There were 4 fatalities out of 1.3 million homes which were beneficiaries of this overall scheme, for which the shoddy operators who were operating as contractors were then held accountable under OH&S law. But taken together, these 3 sets of measures produced a 10% drop in our emissions in real terms over this period. So therefore, my argument to you is that what we do as government policy and through government legislation has a measurable empirical effect. And if we had sustained a carbon price through to the present, that effect would have been even much more profound. Let me conclude by saying that for the future, I would recommend 10 simple points. And that is, what should governments of the left and the right... You seem to be very excited up the front, sir. Sorry? You got a problem with what I'm saying? No problem. You seem to be very demonstrable in the front row. I'll take my first question from you. Number 1 is Australia must commit in legislation to net zero emissions by 2050, establishing a clear adaptation glide path over the next 30 years. Second, Australia needs a carbon price as a matter of urgency. Business needs certainty. The financial sector is already voting with its feet. Third, take the decision by Fink, most recently on behalf of BlackRock in the United States. Third, in the absence of a carbon price, Australia would need to achieve the same mitigation effect through regulation in power generation, product standards, including motor vehicles, and energy efficiency. Fourth, Australia cannot support an expansion of coal-fired generating capacity. Private finance will no longer support such projects. That's the impact of what BlackRock's most recent decision is, and it will be taken up across all the financial majors worldwide. Fifth, Australia should make greater use of gas domestically to help reduce our long-term domestic reliance on coal-fired power stations. Natural gas is still carbon, but is less damaging than coal. Gas is a great bridging energy resource to a carbon-neutral future, including, if necessary, for baseload power stations. 6, Australia should be standing at the forefront of global solar research and storage, as well as the renewable energy sector more generally. 7, Australia's venture capital industry needs to back renewable energy research. If further tax incentives are necessary for this, then it should be done. Superannuation funds in this country, which already benefit extensively from government policy, must play a bigger role. 8, Australia can also export the materials needed through this decarbonising transition. We have lithium reserves for batteries and other metals which are widely used in renewable generation. There's no reason also why lithium batteries cannot be made here. 9, a national clean energy adjustment fund will be needed to support individuals, companies and communities to adapt to decarbonisation with new jobs and new industries. And finally, global climate change action is a great diplomatic opportunity for middle powers such as Australia. You see, for us, the bottom line is this. The world watches what we do domestically, but we have a huge interest, national interest, in what the world does globally on GHG reduction, greenhouse gas reduction. When you hear Conservatives say, it doesn't matter what we do because the rest of the world is so big and we are so small, it glides over one point. As the driest continent on Earth, which has just been through the great summer inferno, we have a material national interest in leveraging effective national action through international forums to maximise global action to bring down global greenhouse gas emissions. That's the only thing that works in terms of bringing down temperatures for Australia for the future. But we can't enter that space so long as we choose to remain as pariahs outside the tent, which is where we are at present. So it's not a question of dewy-eyed sentimentalism and idealism saying that we should be out there because it's just the right thing to do. Well, it is the right thing to do. But it is in our economic self-interest to do it in terms of leveraging other countries around the world to act on bringing down their emissions. We have a fundamental national interest in being national, international leaders on climate change action as we once were, not because it's a vague political aspiration. It is only by that means that we can achieve reductions necessary to keep temperature increases this century within 1.5 degrees centigrade. There is no alternative course or path to the future. Thank you, and I look forward to the first question from him.